The Vengeance of Eleanor Sterling. Get ready, because when Eleanor Sterling decided to reveal the truth, nobody walked away unscathed. Imagine the scene. The most exclusive charity gala in New York City, 300 members of the social elite, and a powerful CEO who thinks he's deceived his wife perfectly. But she discovered everything 6 months ago, and tonight, she didn't just come to dance. What unfolded on that stage was so devastating, so perfectly calculated, it became a legend in New York's high society. This is the true story of how one woman transformed her greatest humiliation into the most elegant revenge ever seen. Subscribe to our channel for more stories like this. Richard Maxwell adjusted his bow tie for the 3rd time in front of the Venetian mirror in his study. The reflection staring back was of a 50-year-old man at the pinnacle of success. Perfectly styled salt and pepper hair, an impeccable Italian suit, and a smile that had already sealed dozens of multi-million-dollar deals. But today, something different flickered in his brown eyes, an anxiety he rarely allowed to show. The Hope Foundation Gala was the most important social event of the year in New York. Business tycoons, politicians, celebrities, and the city's elite would gather at the luxurious Plaza Hotel. Richard had sponsored the event for the past 5 years, always accompanied by Eleanor, his wife of 22 years. But this year would be different. His fingers delicately touched the golden invitation on his mahogany desk. 2 invitations, actually. One addressed to Milan Richard Maxwell. The other, simply, to my Richard Maxwell and guest. The second had arrived discreetly via his private secretary, with a handwritten note that read only, "So we can make our union official in front of society. With love, Isabella." Isabella Cruz. The name echoed in his mind like a seductive melody. At 32, she was everything Eleanor had stopped being. Vibrant, passionate, full of dreams and ambition. The marketing director for a rival company, she had entered his life 6 months ago during a business conference in London. What began as a professional attraction quickly turned into something much more dangerous and overwhelming. Richard remembered that first encounter perfectly. Isabella had aggressively challenged his strategies during a lecture, forcing him to defend his viewpoints with a passion he hadn't felt in years. After the event, she approached him to apologize, but in her green eyes, he saw not regret, but defiance. They had dinner together that night, and Richard realized it had been decades since he had talked to someone who truly stimulated him intellectually. Eleanor, on the other hand, had settled into the role of a high society wife. Her days were now confined to charity luncheons, spa sessions, and overseeing the renovation of their Hamptons house. Their conversations revolved around social gossip and complaints about the staff. The love they once shared had faded into a cordial domestic coexistence, interrupted only by discussions about investments and social obligations. The phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. It was Isabella. "My love." Her voice had that velvety quality that always made him forget where he was. "Are you ready for our big night?" "Isabella, we need to talk about this." Richard hesitated, looking at the framed photo on his desk, where Eleanor smiled beside him during a trip to Paris last year. "I'm not sure this is the right time to—" "Richard." She cut him off softly but firmly. "We talked about this yesterday, and last week, and last month. You said you were tired of living a lie, that you wanted to take our relationship public." It was true. During a moment of passion at her apartment, after a particularly harsh argument with Eleanor about his constant absence from home, Richard had declared he was ready to leave his marriage and start a new life. Isabella had beamed with joy, talking about how they could finally be happy together, without having to hide. But now, with the gala just 2 hours away, reality was knocking on his door like an unpaid bill. Eleanor wasn't just his wife. She was his silent partner, owning 40% of the company's shares. Her lawyers had already made it clear that a divorce could be financially catastrophic. Moreover, Eleanor came from one of New York's most traditional families, the Sterlings, whose political and social influence had opened many doors for his business over the years. "Will you pick me up at 8? Isabella's voice brought him back to the present. "Of course," he replied, his voice sounding more confident than he felt. "Wear the blue dress we bought in London. You'll be stunning." After hanging up, Richard walked to the window of his 22nd floor office. The city stretched out before him, a sea of lights just beginning to twinkle as night approached. Somewhere down there, Eleanor was getting ready in their penthouse suite, where she had spent the afternoon at one of the city's most expensive spas. She had mentioned at breakfast that she would wear the Valentino dress they had bought in Rome. His mind flashed back 3 hours to when Eleanor had called to confirm he would pick her up at 7:30. Her voice sounded strange on the phone, colder than usual, but he had attributed it to the stress of the preparations. Eleanor always got nervous before important social events, worried about making the right impression. What she didn't know, or at least he hoped she didn't know, was that for the past 6 months, Richard had built an elaborate web of lies to keep his relationship with Isabella a secret. Fake business trips, bogus meetings, even a secret apartment where they could meet discreetly. Everything was carefully planned, so his two lives would never cross paths. Until tonight, Richard looked at the 2 invitations again. A decision needed to be made. He could continue living the lie, escort Eleanor to the gala as the exemplary husband all of New York society knew, and meet Isabella secretly another time. Or he could finally have the courage to own up to his true feelings, even if it cost him everything he had built. His phone vibrated with a message from Isabella. "Can't wait to dance with you in front of everyone. It'll be our first dance as a real couple." Then, almost immediately, a message came from Eleanor. "Darling, I changed my mind about the dress. I'm going to wear the gold one you said was your favorite. I want to be perfect for you tonight." Richard felt a cold sweat run down his back. Eleanor never showed that kind of attention to his desires about clothes. In fact, she rarely asked for his opinion on anything related to her appearance. Something was different, but he couldn't identify what. His thoughts were interrupted by the arrival of his chauffeur, Carl, who knocked discreetly on the door. "Mr. Maxwell, the car is ready. Where to first?" The question echoed in the study like an ultimatum. Richard looked one last time at the photo of Eleanor, then at his phone, where Isabella's message still shone on the screen. Finally, his eyes fell upon a third photo he kept in a locked drawer. A photo of Isabella smiling during a weekend they had spent together in Aspen, when Eleanor was visiting her mother in London. "We'll pick up Ms. Cruz first," he said finally, his voice firm but loaded with consequence. "Then we'll go on to the gala." The chauffeur nodded and withdrew. Richard stood alone for a few more minutes, knowing he was about to cross a line from which he might never return. But for the first time in months, he felt truly alive. He had no idea that Eleanor had discovered Isabella 3 weeks ago, thanks to a private investigator she had hired to confirm her suspicions. He also didn't know that his wife had spent the last few days meticulously planning her own strategy for the night of the gala. And he certainly didn't imagine that at that exact moment, Eleanor was in her own car, following a carefully calculated route that would ensure she arrived at the gala just minutes after him and his guest. The game had begun, and all the players were positioning themselves on the board. What would you do if you were in Eleanor's shoes? Confront him or plan your revenge? The public reveal, the main ballroom of the Plaza Hotel, had never looked so dazzling. Austrian crystal chandeliers hung from the ornate ceiling, casting golden reflections over tables covered in French silk. More than 300 guests circulated through the room, a parade of designer dresses and impeccable tuxedos, as a chamber orchestra played classical waltzes. Richard adjusted his cuff for the 10th time in 5 minutes. Beside him, Isabella radiated elegance in a stunning sapphire blue dress that hugged her curves. Her brown hair was styled in a sophisticated bun, highlighting the diamond necklace he had given her last month. "You're nervous," she observed, gently touching his arm. "Relax, love. This is our night." Richard forced a smile. Since they had arrived 20 minutes ago, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched more closely than usual. Several acquaintances had approached to greet them, and although they maintained their usual cordiality, Richard perceived a speculative glint in their eyes. Eleanor's absence was not going unnoticed. "Mr. Maxwell," the shrill voice of Martha Sterling, one of the event organizers, and Eleanor's distant cousin, cut through the air. She approached with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "What a surprise to see you here with such a young and charming guest." "Martha," Richard replied with practiced diplomacy, "I'd like you to meet Isabella Cruz, Marketing Director of Cruz & Associates. Isabella, this is Martha Sterling, one of the pillars of our charity society. It's a pleasure to meet you, Mrs. Sterling." Isabella extended her hand with grace, but Richard noticed the almost imperceptible tension in her voice. "The pleasure is all mine, dear." Martha shook the offered hand, her eyes examining Isabella from head to toe. "And Eleanor? Isn't she coming tonight? What a shame. She adores this event. In fact, she suggested this year's theme. Eleanor is under the weather." Richard lied with ease, a skill he had perfected in recent months. "A terrible cold. She insisted I come anyway since we are the main sponsors." "Ah, what a pity indeed," Martha murmured, but her tone suggested anything but pity. "Well, I hope she recovers soon. We'll give her your regards, of course." After Martha walked away, Isabella turned to Richard with a worried expression. "She knows," she said in a low voice, "the way she looked at me. Richard, I have the impression that everyone here knows." "You're imagining things," he replied, but his own confidence was faltering. "Let's go dance. That'll help you relax." The dance floor was moderately full, couples twirling in an elegant waltz. Richard led Isabella to the center, and she surrendered to the music with a natural grace that made several couples stop to admire them. For a moment, Richard allowed himself to forget his worries and simply enjoy the feeling of holding Isabella in his arms publicly. It was then that he saw her. Eleanor was standing at the main entrance of the ballroom, chatting with the maitre d'. She wore a gold dress that Richard didn't recognize, not the Valentino she had mentioned, but something new, more daring, that enhanced her still slender figure at 48. Her blonde hair was loose, falling in soft waves over her shoulders, and she wore the family jewels, the diamond tiara that had belonged to the Sterling women for 3 generations. But what most caught Richard's attention was her posture. Eleanor did not look like the betrayed and humiliated wife he had imagined. On the contrary, she radiated an almost royal confidence, as if she were the true hostess of the event. "What's wrong?" Isabella asked, feeling him stiffen during the dance. "Nothing," he murmured, trying to keep Eleanor in his line of sight, without being obvious. "Just keep dancing." Eleanor finished her conversation with the maitre d' and began walking through the ballroom. She wasn't alone. A tall, gray-haired man in an impeccable tuxedo accompanied her. Richard recognized him instantly. Dr. Alexander Mitchell, one of the most respected lawyers in the city, and a specialist in corporate law, no less. Richard's stomach clenched. Why would Eleanor be accompanied by Mitchell? And why did she look so triumphant? The music came to an end, and Richard led Isabella off the floor. He needed some fresh air to think clearly, but before they could head to the terrace, Eleanor appeared before them like a golden apparition. "Richard, darling." Her voice sounded melodic, almost cheerful. "What a surprise to find you here." The shock Richard felt was like a punch to the stomach. There was his wife, elegant and smiling, while he was accompanied by his mistress in front of 300 members of New York's high society. "Eleanor," he managed to stammer. "I thought you said you were sick." "Ah, yes," she laughed, a crystalline sound that attracted the attention of several nearby people. "Fortunately, I recovered in time. I couldn't miss the gala, especially not tonight." She turned to Isabella with a radiant smile. "And you must be Isabella Cruz. I've heard so much about you." Isabella visibly paled. "Mrs. Maxwell, Please call me Eleanor," she interrupted kindly. "After all, we're practically intimate, aren't we? Richard tells me all about his work meetings." The double meaning was unmistakable, but said with such elegance that no one else but the three of them could have noticed. Richard felt a cold sweat run down his back. "Eleanor, can we talk in private?" he whispered urgently. "Later, darling. It wouldn't be proper to abandon our guest right now." She turned back to Isabella. "You look beautiful, dear. This dress is a unique piece, isn't it? I recognize Madame Dubois's work. Richard has impeccable taste in gifts." Isabella unconsciously touched the diamond necklace on her neck, and Richard realized with horror that Eleanor had noticed the gesture. "Ah, and this necklace," Eleanor continued, her voice still as sweet as honey. "It's absolutely dazzling. It must have cost, well, it must have cost a pretty penny." Richard was always generous with his special collaborators. At that moment, Dr. Mitchell approached the group. "Eleanor, my dear, forgive the interruption." He offered a cordial smile to Richard and Isabella. "Richard, a pleasure to see you. And you must be Ms. Cruz. We've heard so much about you." "We've heard?" Richard repeated, his voice sounding strange even to himself. "Oh, yes," Mitchell smiled. "Eleanor told me about the innovations you are implementing in the company. Very interesting, I must say." Richard looked from Mitchell to Eleanor, trying to figure out what was happening. His wife maintained a serene, almost innocent expression, but he knew that glint in her eyes. It was the same glint she had when she won a high-stakes bid at an art auction. "Well," Eleanor announced suddenly, "I think it's time we do what we came to do." "What you came to do?" Isabella asked, her voice barely a whisper. Eleanor smiled, and for the first time that night, Richard saw a flicker of the woman he had married 22 years ago. Determined, intelligent, and completely ruthless when necessary. "Why don't we find out together?" Eleanor made a discreet signal to the maitre d', who immediately went to the stage where the orchestra was. The sound of the instruments gradually ceased, and all conversations in the ballroom quieted down. The maitre d' delicately tapped a crystal glass, drawing everyone's attention. "Ladies and gentlemen," his voice echoed through the sound system, "we have the pleasure of inviting Mrs. Eleanor Sterling Maxwell to the stage for a few special words." Richard's blood ran cold. Eleanor never gave speeches at social events. She always left that part to him or to other organizers. "Excuse me," Eleanor said sweetly, touching Richard's arm. "Duty calls." She walked towards the stage with the grace of a queen, leaving Richard, Isabella, and Mitchell in a silence charged with tension. Around them, guests positioned themselves to get a better view of the stage. On stage, Eleanor delicately adjusted the microphone and smiled at the audience. The light from the spotlights made her diamond tiara sparkle like stars. "Good evening, friends," her voice sounded clear and confident. "First of all, I'd like to thank all of you for being here today, contributing to such a noble cause as the Hope Foundation." Polite applause echoed through the ballroom. "As many of you know," Eleanor continued, "my family has a long tradition of philanthropy in this city, and tonight, I'd like to announce a new chapter in that tradition." Richard felt his legs trembling. Whatever Eleanor was planning, he was sure it wouldn't be good for him. "Starting today," Eleanor announced, her voice gaining strength, "I will personally assume the presidency of the Hope Foundation, and to fund our new projects, I will have the pleasure of making the largest individual donation in the Foundation's history." Murmurs of admiration spread through the audience. $50 million, Eleanor declared, and the ballroom erupted in enthusiastic applause. Richard felt as if he had been struck by lightning. $50 million was practically their entire joint account for personal investments. How could she access that amount without his signature? "And now," Eleanor continued as the applause subsided, "I'd like to invite a very special person to join me on stage. A person who has been instrumental in certain recent changes in my life." Richard's heart stopped completely. "Isabella Cruz, would you please come up here?" The entire ballroom turned to look in the direction where Richard and Isabella were standing. Isabella was as pale as a ghost, her hands visibly trembling. "Go," Richard whispered urgently. "We have no other choice." With hesitant steps, Isabella walked towards the stage, under the curious gazes of all of New York's elite. Richard remained where he was, feeling as if he were watching a car crash in slow motion. Eleanor extended her hand to help Isabella up onto the stage. Her smile never wavered. "Ladies and gentlemen," she announced, "I'd like you to meet Isabella Cruz, an extraordinary woman who changed my perspective on many things." Richard closed his eyes, bracing himself for the worst. Beside him, Dr. Mitchell watched the scene with professional interest. "You see," Eleanor continued, "Isabella taught me a very valuable lesson about the importance of honesty in relationships. And because of that, tonight, I decided to be completely honest with all of you about some important changes in my life." The ballroom was in complete silence, every person hanging on her every word. "After 22 years of marriage," Eleanor announced in a clear and firm voice, "I am divorcing my husband, Richard Maxwell." The impact was immediate. Murmurs of astonishment echoed through the ballroom, and several people turned to look directly at Richard. He felt as if the ground had disappeared beneath his feet. But Eleanor wasn't finished. "And also, tonight," she continued, "I'd like to announce that, as part of the already formalized divorce settlement, I will be taking total control of Maxwell and Associates as I own, through my family holding 65% of the company's shares." Richard's world fell apart completely. 65%? That was impossible. He owned 55%, Eleanor 40%, and the employees the remaining through a profit-sharing program. "As some of you may not know," Eleanor explained calmly, "over the past 6 months, I have discreetly acquired the employees' shares in addition to an additional package that my husband had, inadvertently, put up as collateral for some undeclared personal loans." Richard remembered with horror the loans he had taken out to maintain his secret apartment and fund his expensive gifts for Isabella, loans he had secured with his own company shares, thinking he could pay them off quickly. "But don't worry," Eleanor smiled radiantly at the shocked audience. "The company will continue to operate normally under new management, and I am sure you will all understand that this was a very difficult but necessary decision for my emotional well-being." She turned to Isabella, who was standing beside her like a marble statue. "And now, Isabella, I'd like you to say a few words to our guests. After all, you played such an important role in this revelation." The silence in the ballroom was deafening. 300 members of New York's high society seemed to have forgotten how to breathe, their eyes fixed on the drama unfolding on the stage. Isabella was motionless, as if she had turned to stone, while Eleanor maintained her serene smile, waiting for a response. "Me?" Isabella began, her voice barely coming out of her throat. The microphone caught the fragile sound and amplified it for the entire ballroom. "I don't know what to say." "Oh dear," Eleanor replied with a poisonous sweetness. "I'm sure you'll find the right words. After all, you were always so eloquent in your private messages." Richard felt the blood drain completely from his face. Private messages. Eleanor knew about the messages. He looked around desperately for a way out, but he was surrounded by familiar faces, watching him with a mix of shock, morbid curiosity, and thinly veiled pleasure at someone else's misfortune. "Eleanor, no!" Richard's voice echoed through the ballroom, louder than he intended. All eyes turned to him, and he felt as if he were naked before the crowd. "Ah, Richard," Eleanor greeted him cheerfully in his direction. "It's good that you've come forward. Why don't you come up here too? After all, this is a family moment." The last thing Richard wanted was to get on that stage, but the social pressure was overwhelming. Hundreds of eyes watched him, waiting for his next move. With steps that felt trapped in mud, he walked towards the stage. When he reached Eleanor and Isabella's side, he could see up close the complete transformation of his wife. The woman he had known for more than 2 decades had disappeared, replaced by someone cold, calculating, and absolutely ruthless. "Perfect," she said to the audience. "Now we have all the main characters gathered for the finale of our little play." She turned her attention to her phone. "Let's see. Here's a particularly interesting message sent last week. My love, I can't wait to get rid of this marriage farce. Eleanor is just an obstacle between us and our happiness. Soon we'll be free to live our love openly." The ballroom erupted in muffled murmurs. Richard closed his eyes, wishing the earth would open up and swallow him. "And here," Eleanor continued mercilessly, "we have an equally touching response from Ms. Cruz. Richard, you are the man of my dreams. I can't stand having to hide anymore. When you finally get rid of that cold and calculating woman, we can be truly happy." Isabella let out an audible sob. Tears began to run down her face, ruining her carefully applied makeup. "Cold and calculating woman," Eleanor repeated, savoring every word. An interesting description, considering that this cold and calculating woman was the one who built half of the business empire you two were so eager to enjoy. Dr. Mitchell, who had remained discreetly at the foot of the stage, chose this moment to step forward. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his professional voice cutting through the tension. "I apologize for the interruption, but perhaps it would be appropriate to clarify some legal aspects of the situation." Eleanor nodded gracefully. "Please, Doctor, I think our guests would be interested in knowing the technical details." Mitchell went up on stage and stood next to the microphone. "As Mrs. Eleanor Maxwell's attorney, I can confirm that all legal procedures were duly formalized this afternoon at the county court. The divorce petition includes the division of assets according to the partial community property regime, in addition to the dissolution of the business partnership." He paused, allowing the information to be absorbed by the audience. "Furthermore," he continued, "due to certain fiscal irregularities discovered in Mr. Maxwell's personal accounts, including undeclared loans and the misuse of business resources for personal purposes, the IRS will be notified on Monday for a full audit." Richard's world fell apart completely. Fiscal irregularities? Business resources? He had been extremely careful to keep his extramarital activities separate from the company's finances. Or at least, he thought he had been. "Dr. Mitchell," Richard managed to say, his voice coming out as a croak. "Can I know specifically what irregularities you are referring to?" Mitchell smiled coldly. "Of course, Mr. Maxwell. I'm referring to the $200,000 transferred from the business account to finance the apartment on Madison Avenue, registered under a shell company's name. Also to the undeclared expenses on jewelry, travel, and other gifts acquired with corporate cards for clearly personal purposes." Richard felt his legs weaken. How had Eleanor discovered the apartment? He had been meticulous in hiding that property, using an offshore company he had created years ago for other investments. "Furthermore," Mitchell continued inexorably, "there's the matter of the fraudulent contracts with Cruz and Associates, where fictitious consulting services were billed to justify the transfer of resources to personal accounts." Isabella paled even more, if that were possible. "What contracts?" she whispered. "Oh dear!" Eleanor turned to her with false compassion. Didn't you know? Your beloved Richard created fake contracts between his company and yours to justify the payment of more than $500,000 over the past 6 months. Money that, coincidentally, was used to fund the lavish lifestyle you two were enjoying. That's a lie, Richard exploded, finally finding his voice. Those contracts were legitimate. Isabella provided real consulting services. Ah, yes, Eleanor laughed, a sound that chilled everyone in the ballroom. Consulting services? Is that what you call it now? She turned back to her phone and began scrolling through the screen. How interesting. Here's a message from you, Richard. My love, the $50,000 consulting contract was approved. Now we can take that trip to Paris you wanted. And the response from Ms. Cruz. Richard, you are perfect. I can't wait to celebrate in our special apartment. Richard's anger turned into panic. If Eleanor had intercepted his messages, she knew everything. Every meeting, every intimate moment he had shared with Isabella. How? He asked, his voice barely a whisper. How did you find out? Eleanor smiled, and for the first time that night, her smile seemed genuine. Oh, Richard, did you really think I was the clueless, domesticated wife you pretended me to be? I knew something was wrong months ago. Your constant absences, your increasingly elaborate lies, the inexplicable expenses. She walked around him, like a predator, circling its prey. So I hired a private investigator, and what interesting discoveries he made. Not only about your relationship with Ms. Cruz, but also about your creative interpretations of tax law. Richard looked desperately at Isabella, seeking some kind of support or solidarity. But she was clearly in shock. Tears ran freely down her face. Eleanor, he tried one last strategy. We can resolve this privately. There's no need to involve all these people. All these people? Eleanor looked around the ballroom, as if she were only now remembering the audience. Oh, but Richard, these people are our family, our friends, our business partners. They have the right to know what kind of man you really are. Dr. Mitchell cleared his throat discreetly. Mrs. Sterling, perhaps it's appropriate to mention the amicable separation agreement we offered Mr. Maxwell. Ah, yes, Eleanor nodded. How forgetful of me. Richard, even after all these unpleasant revelations, I'm still willing to be generous. She turned to him, her expression becoming almost maternal. You can keep 10% of the company, enough for a comfortable retirement. You can also keep the beach house and the apartment where you were consulting with Ms. Cruz. And in exchange? Richard asked, although he already feared the answer. In exchange, Eleanor replied softly, you will sign a full confession about the fiscal irregularities, taking full responsibility. You will also agree never to be involved in the Sterling family businesses again, or to attempt to contact any member of our family. And if I refuse? Eleanor's smile turned glacial. Then, my dear, you will spend the next 5 to 10 years explaining your creative actions to the IRS and the district attorney's office. And Ms. Cruz will have to explain her participation in the fraudulent contracts. Isabella sobbed audibly. I didn't know, she said, her voice breaking. I swear I didn't know the contracts were fake. Oh, darling. Eleanor turned to her with a compassion that seemed almost sincere. I believe you. That's why I'm offering you an opportunity to redeem yourself. What opportunity? Isabella asked. Clinging to an hope, you can testify about Richard's involvement in the creation of the fraudulent contracts. In return, your company will receive full immunity, and you can continue your career without major problems. No! Richard exploded. Isabella, don't listen to her. We can fight this together. Isabella looked from Richard to Eleanor, and then to the crowd of faces watching them. Finally, her eyes rested on Dr. Mitchell. If I testify? She asked hesitantly. What will happen to Richard? That will depend on him, Mitchell replied diplomatically. If he accepts the agreement, the consequences will be minimized. If he decides to fight, He left the phrase hanging in the air, but the implication was clear. Eleanor returned to the microphone, addressing the audience once more. "Friends," she said, her voice returning to a cheerful and confident tone. "I know this evening has brought some unexpected revelations, but I want you to know that life goes on, and it goes on in a very positive way." She paused, allowing the suspense to build. "I'd like to announce that starting next week, Maxwell & Associates will be renamed Sterling Holdings, returning to its family roots. I'm very excited to work with all of you in building an even more prosperous future." Hesitant applause began to echo through the ballroom. The New York elite was clearly divided between shock and admiration for the masterful way Eleanor had orchestrated the entire situation. "And now," Eleanor announced, "I believe our special guests would like to retire to discuss the details of the proposed agreements." It was a polite, but unequivocal, dismissal. Richard looked one last time at the crowd of familiar faces, knowing that his life, as he knew it, had ended that night. Some looked at him with pity, others with curiosity, but most just seemed relieved not to be in his place. "Let's go," he said to Isabella, offering her his arm. It was the least he could do after dragging her into this catastrophe. When they descended the stage, Dr. Mitchell followed them discreetly. "There's a private room reserved for our conversation," he informed them. "I suggest we take advantage of the rest of the night to resolve all outstanding issues." As they left the main ballroom, Richard heard Eleanor take the microphone again. "And now," her voice echoed behind them, "how about we get back to the celebrations? The orchestra will offer us a special waltz, and I hope you all enjoy the rest of this memorable evening." The music resumed, and the hum of conversations gradually returned to the ballroom. The New York high society had witnessed one of the most spectacular scandals in its history, and now they could enjoy the pleasure of analyzing it in detail for months to come. As he walked down the hotel's gilded hallways, Richard realized that his life had been completely destroyed and rebuilt in the space of 30 minutes. And the architect of his ruin was back on the stage, dancing gracefully with the guests, as if nothing extraordinary had happened. Eleanor Sterling had played the final game, and she had won, absolutely. Like this video if you're on Eleanor's side. The consequences and the final victory 6 months after the gala, which became a legend among New York's high society. The office on the 22nd floor had a new occupant. Eleanor Sterling sat behind the same mahogany desk that once belonged to Richard. But the atmosphere had been completely transformed. The walls now displayed Spanish contemporary art instead of corporate trophies, and large arrangements of fresh flowers brought life and color to the space. She was reviewing the quarterly reports of the now renamed Sterling Holdings, satisfied with the numbers she saw. The company had not only recovered from the scandal, but was thriving under her new leadership. The transition had been surprisingly smooth, mainly because most clients and business partners had long considered her the true force behind the company's success. A gentle knock on the door interrupted her thoughts. Marcia, her new executive assistant, entered with a slightly worried expression. "Ms. Sterling, there's a person here who would like to speak with you. She said she doesn't have an appointment, but that it's important." "Who is it?" "Isabella Cruz." Eleanor looked up from the documents, genuinely surprised. In the 6 months since the night of the gala, she had had minimal contact with Isabella, mainly through lawyers during the legal proceedings that followed. Send her in, Eleanor decided, curious about what could have brought her ex-husband's former mistress there. Isabella entered the office with visible hesitation. She was noticeably thinner, her hair cut in a more conservative style, and she wore a simple business suit that contrasted dramatically with the daring elegance Eleanor remembered from the night of the gala. "Eleanor," she began, then corrected herself. "Ms. Sterling, thank you for seeing me. Please have a seat. Eleanor gestured toward one of the armchairs in front of her desk. "Can I offer you coffee? Water? Coffee would be great, thank you." Eleanor placed the order with Marcia, who withdrew discreetly. An awkward silence settled between the two women until the coffee arrived. "Well," Eleanor finally said, "I imagine you didn't just come here for a social visit." Isabella took a deep breath, as if preparing for something difficult. "I came to thank you," she said, the words coming out in a rush. "I know it might sound strange, but I need to thank you for what you did that night." Eleanor raised an eyebrow, genuinely surprised. "Thank me? Isabella, I practically destroyed your reputation in public and forced you to testify against Richard." "You saved me," Isabella corrected, her words gaining strength. "In the last 6 months, I've had time to understand what really happened. Richard wasn't just cheating on me, he was manipulating me, using me, and I was too young and stupid to realize it." She paused to take a sip of her coffee, her hands trembling slightly. "When I started to really analyze our relationship, I realized how many lies he had told me, not just about you, but about everything. The consulting contracts I thought were legitimate. The expensive gifts he said came from his personal investments. Even the things he told me about his feelings." Isabella looked directly at Eleanor for the first time since she had entered. "After everything was over, I found old messages from him on my phone, messages I had forgotten about. In one of them, he said you were just a phase he needed to get over, that he had never really loved you. In another, he talked about how easy it was to manipulate emotional women like me." Eleanor felt a pang of what might have been pity. "No," she continued with determination. "I need to say this. During the 6 months our relationship lasted, I thought I was living a great love story. I thought Richard had found something in me that he couldn't find in you. But the truth is he was just bored, and I was convenient." She stood up and walked to the window, looking at the city. "When you revealed everything that night, I felt humiliated, betrayed, destroyed. But I also felt liberated, because I was finally able to see Richard for what he really was." "And what was that?" Eleanor asked softly. "A man who had no respect for any of the women in his life," Isabella replied without hesitation. "He lied to you for months. He stole money from the company you built together, and he used me as a fantasy to escape his responsibilities." She turned back to Eleanor. "You, on the other hand, when you discovered what was happening, you didn't just take revenge out of rage. You protected yourself. You protected your assets and, strangely, you protected me too." "How did I protect you?" "By offering me a way out," Isabella explained. "You could have completely destroyed me, included me in the criminal charges, ruined my career. Instead, you gave me the opportunity to tell the truth and start over." Eleanor studied the younger woman's face, looking for signs of manipulation or insincerity, but finding only a weary honesty. "And how is your life now?" she asked. "Different." Isabella smiled for the first time since she had entered. "Very different. I had to rebuild my professional reputation from scratch. Some clients abandoned me when the scandal broke, but others respected my honesty in cooperating with the investigations." She returned to the armchair. "I also started therapy. I needed to understand how I had allowed myself to be so completely deceived, and, well, I learned a lot about myself." "Like what?" "Like how I confused excitement with love, secrets with intimacy, and expensive gifts with genuine affection," Isabella replied with brutal honesty. "Richard made me feel special, but it was the specialness of being a secret, of being a conquest. It was never about loving me for who I really am." Eleanor nodded slowly. She recognized those feelings, though from a different perspective. "And Richard?" she asked. "Have you heard anything from him?" Isabella shook her head. "He tried to contact me several times in the first few months, but I didn't respond. I heard he moved to Chicago and is trying to start over there, but I don't know the details, and I prefer it that way." "He signed the agreement." Eleanor already knew the answer, but she wanted to hear Isabella's perspective. Yes, he signed it the morning after the gala. I think he finally realized he had no real choice. Isabella hesitated. Eleanor, can I ask you something? Of course. Did you always know he didn't really love me? Even that night when it seemed like he had chosen me to accompany him to the gala instead of you? Eleanor considered the question carefully before answering. Isabella, over 22 years of marriage, I learned to read Richard very well, and one thing I always knew about him is that he loved himself above all else. When I discovered what was going on with you, my first reaction was pain and anger. But when I started to investigate further, I realized that you weren't a rival. You were just another object he wanted to possess. How can you be so sure? Because, Eleanor explained kindly, if Richard had truly loved you, he would have left our marriage honestly, divided the assets according to the law, faced the social consequences, and built a new life with you. Instead, he tried to maintain both situations, lying to both of us. Isabella slowly felt the puzzle pieces finally click into place. You're right. Even when he said he wanted a divorce, there were always excuses to postpone it. It was never the right time, or there were complications that needed to be resolved first. Exactly, Eleanor said. Richard wanted to have the best of both worlds, the stability and social status of the marriage with me, and the excitement of the secret relationship with you. He never had any intention of truly choosing. A comfortable silence settled between them. Eleanor studied Isabella, seeing a woman who had matured significantly in the last few months. Can I ask why you really came here today? Eleanor said finally. I know it wasn't just to thank me. Isabella smiled, a genuine smile this time. You know me well, even without knowing me at all. She took a deep breath. I came to make you a business proposal. A proposal? My company is growing, but I need a larger partner for some international projects. I researched Sterling Holdings, and you have exactly the experience and resources I need. Eleanor leaned back in her chair, intrigued. And you think I would consider doing business with you after everything that happened? I think you are a shrewd businesswoman, Isabella replied with growing confidence. And I think you recognize talent when you see it, regardless of personal circumstances. She continued. Isabella opened her briefcase and took out a carefully prepared presentation. I am specializing my company in digital marketing for businesses that want to expand into international markets. In the last 6 months, I've secured 3 major clients who want to enter the European market, but I need a partner with international trade experience. She handed the documents to Eleanor. This would be a strictly professional partnership, with clear and transparent contracts. Nothing like the fake contracts Richard created. Eleanor scanned the documents, impressed despite herself by the quality of the presentation and the soundness of the numbers presented. Are these results real? Completely verifiable. I can provide references for all clients, audited financial reports, everything you need. Eleanor continued to study the numbers. The proposal was truly solid, and Sterling Holdings had been considering expanding its digital marketing division. Isabella, she finally said, do you realize how strange it would be for us to work together? What would people say? They would say that 2 smart women overcame a difficult personal situation and found a way to create value together. Isabella replied without hesitation. Or they would say that we are professional enough to separate business from personal matters. And what if it doesn't work? If we found that we couldn't work together, then we would end the professional partnership professionally and move on with our lives, Isabella said simply. But I think we have more in common than you might imagine. How so? We are both women who were underestimated by Richard Maxwell, Isabella said with an ironic smile. He thought you were just a trophy wife, and that I was just a manipulable mistress, and we both proved him wrong. Eleanor laughed, a genuine sound of amusement. You're right. She studied Isabella for a moment longer. Then she made a decision that surprised herself. Okay, I'm going to consider your proposal, but with conditions. What conditions? First, any partnership will be on a smaller scale initially, a pilot project so we can test how we work together. Agreed. Second, detailed contracts for everything, reviewed by independent lawyers. Absolutely. And third, Eleanor seemed to hesitate for the first time. If we're going to work together, we need to completely resolve the past between us, with no hidden resentments, no unresolved discomforts. Isabella nodded with seriousness. Eleanor, I want you to know that I never hated you, even during the relationship with Richard. In fact, I always admired you. He talked about you constantly. Your intelligence, your business acumen, your position in society. I think part of what he saw in me was a younger, less threatening version of you. Less threatening? You were always his intellectual equal, able to challenge and question him. I was easier to control, at least at first. Isabella smiled sadly. Ironically, that's what made our relationship less real to him. Eleanor considered those words, recognizing the truth in them. You know, Isabella, I think you're right. We do have more in common than I thought. We both learned valuable lessons about valuing ourselves and about not letting men like Richard define our worth. Exactly, Isabella added. Eleanor stood up and walked to the window, looking at the city she now saw with new eyes. Not as Richard Maxwell's wife, but as Eleanor Sterling, a successful businesswoman in her own right. All right, she said, turning to Isabella. Let's try this partnership, but we're going to do it the right way. Thank you, Eleanor. I promise you won't regret it. I hope not. And Eleanor? Yes? The next time a man tries to tell you that you're less capable or less valuable than you really are, remember this conversation. Remember that you are strong enough to rebuild your life, smart enough to recognize your mistakes, and brave enough to try something new. Tears shone in Isabella's eyes. Thank you. Isabella, Eleanor said, the same goes for you. You are not just Richard Maxwell's ex-mistress. You are a force of nature all on your own. As Isabella prepared to leave, Eleanor reflected on how life had taken unexpected turns. 6 months ago, at the gala, she had orchestrated the public destruction of her marriage as an act of revenge. But what had emerged from the ashes of that night was something she had never anticipated. A stronger, more independent version of herself. Ah, Isabella, she called as the younger woman reached the door. Yes? I think we should have lunch together next week to discuss the details of the partnership, of course. Of course. Isabella smiled. But this time, it's on me. After all, it would technically be a legitimate business expense. Eleanor laughed heartily, a free and genuine laugh she hadn't let out in months. I accept. After Isabella left, Eleanor returned to her desk and looked at the framed photo she had recently placed there. A photo of her alone, taken during a recent trip to Europe she had made to explore business opportunities. In the photo, she was smiling genuinely, free and confident. There were no more photos of Richard in her office, nor in her home. Not out of anger, but because she had discovered that she didn't need his presence, not even in the form of a memory, to define herself. Her phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. It was Marcia. Ms. Sterling, Dr. Mitchell is on line 1. He said he has good news about the final divorce process. Put him through. It's my pleasure to inform you that all final documents have been signed and registered. You are officially divorced and have total control of Sterling Holdings. Thank you, Dr. Mitchell. It was a pleasure working with you. And I can say I have rarely seen anyone handle such a difficult situation with such elegance and determination. After hanging up, Eleanor allowed herself a moment of quiet satisfaction. The chapter of Richard Maxwell in her life had been definitively closed. But unlike the bitter end she had anticipated, she felt liberated. The woman who had entered that gala 6 months ago was the betrayed wife of Richard Maxwell. The woman who sat in that office today was Eleanor Sterling, businesswoman, philanthropist, and architect of her own destiny. And for the first time in decades, she couldn't wait to discover what the future held. That night, while working late, reviewing proposals for new Sterling Holdings projects, Eleanor received a text message from an unknown number. "Eleanor, I hope you're doing well. I know I don't deserve forgiveness, but I wanted you to know that I recognize the wrong I did to you, and that you were always better than I deserved." She looked at the message for a long moment. Then, she deleted it without responding. There was nothing more to say between them. Instead, she opened a new document on her computer and began to write a business plan for the new partnership with Isabella Cruz. Because while the past had been about revenge and justice, the future would be about growth and possibilities, and Eleanor Sterling was ready to embrace them all. The new office of Sterling Holdings and Cruz Associates occupied 2 entire floors in one of Madrid's most modern buildings. The partnership between Eleanor and Isabella had flourished beyond all expectations, becoming one of the most respected international marketing consultancies in the country. Eleanor was in her office when Isabella entered, with a look of thinly veiled amusement. "You're going to laugh," Isabella announced, waving a magazine in her hands. "About what?" "Richard is in the social column of Hola magazine. Apparently, he married a 25-year-old heiress." Eleanor raised an eyebrow. "The same pattern, then." "The same pattern," Isabella agreed. "But here's the interesting part. According to the magazine, the new wife has already hired a private investigator because she suspects he's having an affair." Eleanor shook her head, more with pity than with satisfaction. "Some men never learn." "No," Isabella agreed, tossing the magazine in the trash. "But some women do, and we are living proof of that." Eleanor smiled, looking out the window at the city she had conquered, not as someone's wife, but as herself. "Yes," she said simply, "we are. Comment your thoughts on the final outcome."